You've probably been doom scrolling for a bit now. Instead, let's dive into some life lesson stories people have shared on Reddit. I hope this video can help wind you down or get you ready for bed. I've looked over quite a few of these stories, and honestly, some of these hit me harder than expected. These aren't just random internet posts. These are real moments that changed real people's perspectives forever. Before we dive in, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and make sure to hype the video so it gets into the algorithm. It helps me more than you know. With that, grab whatever, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's explore some stories that might just shift how you see the world. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll probably look at your own life a little differently. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that the people closest to you aren't always who you think they are. I'm Rachel, and this story is about the night my entire social world collapsed because of a single text message sent to the wrong person. My best friend since middle school, Jessica, and I were inseparable. We did everything together. We had sleepovers every weekend, shared clothes, told each other every secret, and planned to be each other's maid of honor someday. She was the sister I never had, and I trusted her more than anyone in the world. During our junior year of high school, I started dating this guy named Alex from our chemistry class. He was sweet, funny, and I was completely head over heels for him. Jessica seemed really happy for me, always asking about our dates and giving me advice about what to wear or what to say. She'd help me pick out outfits for our dates and would listen to me gush about how perfect he was for hours without complaining. Things were going amazing with Alex for about 3 months. We'd text constantly, spend lunch together, and he'd drive me home from school most days. I felt like I was living in a romantic movie, and Jessica was always there cheering me on from the sidelines, being the perfect supportive best friend. Then one night in November, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I got a text from Jessica that made my blood run cold. The message said, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow night. Rachel still has no idea about us. This has been the best 3 months of my life." I stared at that message for probably 10 minutes, reading it over and over, hoping I was misunderstanding what it meant. But there was no other interpretation. Jessica and Alex had been seeing each other behind my back for the entire duration of what I thought was my relationship with him. My hands were shaking as I realized what had happened. Jessica had obviously meant to send that text to Alex, but had accidentally sent it to me instead. She'd been having an affair with my boyfriend for 3 months while pretending to be my supportive best friend, helping me plan dates with him, listening to me talk about how much I cared about him. I felt like I was going to throw up. Every conversation we'd had about Alex suddenly took on a completely different meaning. When she'd helped me pick out outfits for our dates, she was probably thinking about what Alex would like to see me in. When she'd give me advice about what to say to him, she was probably trying to manipulate me into acting in ways that would benefit whatever game they were playing. I tried calling her immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. I called Alex, and the same thing happened. They were probably together right then, panicking about the message she'd accidentally sent me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, replaying every interaction I'd had with both of them over the past 3 months, looking for signs I'd missed. There were so many red flags I'd ignored or explained away. Times when Alex would cancel plans at the last minute, claiming he had family obligation. Times when Jessica would know things about Alex that I hadn't told her. Times when they'd exchange looks that I thought were just them being friendly. The next morning, Jessica showed up at my house before school with tears in her eyes, an elaborate story about how her phone had been hacked and someone was trying to ruin our friendship. She swore on her grandmother's grave that she would never betray me like that I was the most important person in her life, and that whoever sent that message was trying to destroy us. For about 5 minutes, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think this was all some misunderstanding or cruel prank. But when I asked her specific questions about where she'd been certain nights when Alex had canceled on me, her answers didn't add up. When I asked her to show me her text history with Alex, she claimed she'd already deleted everything to protect me from seeing whatever fake messages the hacker had sent. That's when I knew for certain that my best friend had been lying to my face for months. She wasn't just cheating with my boyfriend, she was actively participating in an elaborate deception that involved helping me prepare for dates with him while she was also seeing him secretly. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. When I told Jessica I knew she was lying and demanded the truth, she completely dropped the innocent act. She told me that Alex had never really been interested in me, that he'd only asked me out because she'd suggested it as a way for them to spend more time together without anyone getting suspicious. She said they'd been attracted to each other since freshman year, but had never acted on it because they didn't want drama. When Alex started showing interest in me, Jessica saw it as the perfect cover for them to be around each other constantly without anyone questioning it. She could hang out with him by pretending to help with our relationship, and no one would suspect anything. The worst part was how she tried to justify it. She told me that she and Alex had real feelings for each other, while what Alex and I had was just a high school crush that would have burned out anyway. She actually said that she was doing me a favor by helping me realize that Alex wasn't the right person for me. I felt like I was talking to a complete stranger. This person who had been my closest friend for years, who knew all my insecurities and fears, was using that knowledge to justify one of the cruelest betrayals I could imagine. She knew exactly how much Alex meant to me, because I'd told her everything, and she'd used that information to manipulate the situation for her own benefit. The social fallout was immediate and brutal. Word spread quickly through school about what had happened, and people took sides. Some of our mutual friends believed Jessica's version of events, where she painted herself as someone who'd fallen in love and made a mistake. Others saw it for what it was, a calculated betrayal that had gone on for months. I lost not just my boyfriend and my best friend, but several other friendships that had been built around our group dynamic. People I'd known for years suddenly felt awkward around me, not knowing whether to stay loyal to Jessica or support me. The whole social structure I'd built my teenage life around collapsed in the span of about a week. The hardest part wasn't even losing Alex. What destroyed me was realizing that someone I'd trusted completely had been capable of such an elaborate deception. Jessica had sat with me while I cried about feeling insecure in the relationship. She'd listened to me worry that Alex might not really like me. She'd reassured me and given me confidence, all while knowing that my insecurities were completely justified because she was the reason Alex was being distant. For months afterward, I questioned every relationship I'd ever had. If Jessica could lie to me so convincingly for so long, how could I trust anyone? I started analyzing every conversation, looking for hidden meanings and secret motivations. I became paranoid and suspicious in ways that weren't healthy, but felt necessary to protect myself from being deceived again. It took me years to learn how to trust people again. And even now, more than a decade later, I'm probably more cautious in relationships than I would have been if this hadn't happened. I learned to pay attention to actions rather than words, to trust my instincts when something feels off, and to understand that some people are capable of maintaining elaborate lies for extended periods without showing obvious signs of guilt. Jessica and Alex stayed together for about 6 months after everything came out, then broke up messily when he apparently did to her what they'd done to me. I heard through mutual friends that she was devastated when she found out he'd been cheating on her, and that she couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel and deceptive. I never spoke to Jessica again after that confrontation. We graduated, went to different colleges, and I made a conscious choice not to maintain any connection with someone who'd shown me that our entire friendship had been conditional on what she could get from it. That night, I received that accidental text message taught me that betrayal rarely comes from enemies or strangers. It comes from people who are close enough to know exactly how to hurt you most effectively. It taught me that some people are capable of compartmentalizing deception in ways that allow them to maintain elaborate lies while still believing they're good people. Most importantly, it taught me that discovering someone's true character is often painful, but it's always better than continuing to trust someone who doesn't deserve it. That betrayal was devastating at the time, but it probably saved me from years of additional manipulation from someone who saw our friendship as something she could exploit rather than something she valued. That's the end of that story. Jessica's betrayal was surgical in its cruelty. 3 months of elaborate deception while pretending to be supportive. Some people are capable of living double lives without showing a crack in their facade. Rachel learned one of life's hardest lessons, that the people closest to you sometimes know exactly where your blind spots are, and some will use that knowledge to devastate you. Our next story comes from someone who learned that life can change in an instant, and that sometimes tragedy leads to the most profound growth. I'm David, and this story is about the 30 seconds that divided my life into before and after. I was 24 years old, fresh out of college, working at my first real job in marketing for a tech startup. I thought I had everything figured out. I was making decent money, had a nice apartment, drove a car I'd saved up for, and was dating someone I thought I might marry. Life felt predictable and comfortable, exactly the way I'd planned it. I was the kind of person who always wore a seatbelt, never texted while driving, and prided myself on being responsible and careful. I'd never been in any kind of serious accident, never broken a bone, never spent a night in a hospital. I took my health and safety for granted because nothing bad had ever happened to me. That Tuesday evening in March, I was driving home from work on a route I'd taken hundreds of times before. It was raining lightly, but nothing that seemed dangerous. I was listening to a podcast, thinking about what I wanted to make for dinner, completely absorbed in the routine of my daily commute. I remember approaching an intersection that I crossed every day, slowing down because the light was turning yellow. I remember thinking I could probably make it through, but deciding to stop instead because the roads were wet and I didn't want to risk it. I remember sitting there at the red light, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for it to change. What I don't remember is the drunk driver who ran the red light going 50 miles per hour and slammed into the driver's side of my car. I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit with tubes coming out of my body and no memory of how I'd gotten there. My parents were sitting beside my bed, looking like they'd aged 10 years in the span of those 3 days. When I tried to ask what had happened, I realized I couldn't speak because of a breathing tube. The next few hours were a blur of doctors and nurses explaining my injuries in medical terms that felt like they were talking about someone else. I had suffered a traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a shattered left arm, and internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery. They told me I'd been unconscious for 72 hours and that they hadn't been sure I would wake up. The drunk driver who hit me had walked away from the accident with minor scratches. As the reality of my situation began to sink in, I felt this overwhelming sense of disbelief. This kind of thing happened to other people, people who made bad choices or took unnecessary risks. I was careful, responsible, someone who always did the right thing. How could my entire life be derailed by someone else's terrible decision? The physical recovery was brutal, but the mental and emotional recovery was even harder. For the first few weeks, I was consumed by anger at the injustice of it all. I spent hours lying in that hospital bed, replaying that evening over and over, wondering what would have happened if I'd left work 5 minutes earlier or later, if I'd taken a different route home, if I'd driven through that yellow light instead of stopping. I learned that the man who hit me was 38 years old, had 2 previous DUI convictions, and had been drinking at a bar for 3 hours before getting in his car that night. He'd made a conscious choice to drive while intoxicated, and I was paying the price for his selfishness and stupidity. My girlfriend at the time tried to be supportive during the first few weeks, but it became clear that she couldn't handle the reality of dating someone with serious injuries and an uncertain recovery timeline. She broke up with me while I was still in the hospital, saying she needed to focus on herself, and that she couldn't handle seeing me like this. That breakup, coming when I was at my most vulnerable, taught me something important about who people really are when things get difficult. Someone I thought loved me unconditionally abandoned me the moment our relationship became inconvenient for her. The doctors told me I'd probably never regain full use of my left arm, that I'd likely have chronic pain and mobility issues for the rest of my life, and that the traumatic brain injury might affect my memory, concentration, and cognitive abilities permanently. They spoke about my new normal and managing expectations about what my life would look like going forward. For months, I was consumed by grief for the life I'd lost. I grieved for the person I used to be, someone who took physical health for granted, who never worried about pain or limitations, who believed that good things happened to good people and that being responsible would protect me from random tragedy. I had to learn to do everything differently. Simple tasks like getting dressed, making breakfast, or driving a car became major challenges that required planning and adaptation. I spent months in physical therapy, slowly rebuilding strength and mobility that might never fully return. But somewhere in that long, painful process of recovery, something shifted in how I understood myself and what mattered to me. Being forced to slow down and depend on others taught me things about resilience, gratitude, and human connection that I never could have learned in my comfortable, predictable life before the accident. I discovered that I was stronger than I'd realized. Not physically, that strength was gone, possibly forever, but mentally and emotionally. I learned that I could adapt to circumstances I never could have imagined facing. I found reserves of patience and determination that I didn't know I possessed. More importantly, I learned to recognize genuine kindness and support from the people around me. My parents, who rearranged their entire lives to help me recover. My brother, who visited me every single day for 3 months and never once made me feel like a burden. Coworkers, who continued to include me in social events, even when I couldn't participate fully. neighbors who checked on me regularly and helped with tasks I couldn't manage alone. The accident also connected me with other people who'd survived traumatic injuries, and I learned that there's an entire community of people who understand what it's like to have your life divided into before and after by circumstances beyond your control. These people taught me that healing isn't about getting back to exactly who you were before. It's about figuring out who you can become after everything changes. 2 years after the accident, I started volunteering with a nonprofit that supports people recovering from traumatic injuries. I discovered that my experience with sudden life-changing trauma, combined with my background in marketing, made me uniquely qualified to help other survivors navigate both the practical and emotional challenges of recovery. That work led me to go back to school for a master's degree in social work, something I never would have considered before the accident. I realized that my previous career, while successful, hadn't given me the sense of purpose and meaning that came from helping people through the most difficult periods of their lives. I'm 32 now, 8 years after the accident. I still have chronic pain, limited mobility in my left arm, and occasional cognitive issues from the brain injury. But I've built a life that's more meaningful and connected than anything I could have imagined in my comfortable, predictable 20s. I work as a trauma counselor now, specializing in helping people adjust to life after sudden injury or illness. I'm married to someone I met through my volunteer work, someone who loves me not despite my limitations, but as the complete person I am now, including the ways that trauma has changed me. The drunk driver who hit me served 18 months in prison and lost his license permanently. I don't spend time thinking about him anymore, because I learned that holding on to anger about things I can't control only hurts me. He made a choice that changed both our lives forever. But I'm the only one who gets to choose what I do with the life I have left. That accident taught me that safety and predictability are illusions we cling to because the alternative, acknowledging how fragile and uncertain life really is, feels too scary to face directly. But once you're forced to confront that uncertainty, you realize that it's also what makes every good moment precious. I learned that resilience isn't something you either have or don't have. It's something you develop by surviving things you didn't think you could survive. And I learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can also be the thing that leads you to the most authentic version of yourself. That's the end of that story. David's accident stripped away everything he thought he could count on. But underneath all that loss, he found parts of himself he never knew existed. Sometimes it takes losing the life you planned to discover the life you were meant to live. Tragedy doesn't always destroy people. Sometimes it reveals who they really are when everything else is stripped away. Let's move to our next story, which comes from someone who learned that standing up to family can be the hardest and most necessary thing you'll ever do. I'm Sarah, and this story is about the day I stopped being afraid of my mother's disapproval and started protecting the child I used to be. Growing up, my mother was what people politely called demanding. She had impossibly high standards for everything: grades, behavior, appearance, social interactions. And she never hesitated to let me know when I fell short of her expectations, which was most of the time. Nothing I did was ever quite good enough. If I got a 95 on a test, she'd ask about the 5 points I'd lost. If I cleaned my room, she'd find the one corner I'd missed. If I made friends, she'd find reasons to criticize them. If I showed interest in activities, she'd point out everything I was doing wrong or suggest how I could be better. My mother justified all of this as pushing me to reach my potential. But what it actually did was teach me that love was conditional on performance, that I was only worth approval when I was perfect, and that making mistakes was not just disappointing, but somehow fundamentally shameful. By the time I was in high school, I was a completely anxious, perfectionist mess. I'd have panic attacks about getting less than perfect grades. I'd spend hours on assignments that should have taken minutes because I was terrified of submitting anything that wasn't flawless. I had almost no social life because I was constantly worried about whether my friends really liked me or were just pretending. The worst part was that I internalized all of my mother's criticism. Her voice became the voice in my head, constantly pointing out my flaws, predicting failure, and reminding me that I wasn't good enough. Even when she wasn't around, I carried her disapproval with me everywhere. I went to college 3 states away, partly because I was excited about the school, but mostly because I desperately needed space from the constant pressure and criticism. Those 4 years were transformative because for the first time in my life, I was around people who accepted me as I was instead of constantly pushing me to be different. I made friends who liked spending time with me, even when I wasn't performing or achieving anything impressive. I dated people who found me attractive and interesting without me having to earn their attention through perfect behavior. I had professors who encouraged my curiosity and creativity instead of just focusing on my mistakes. Slowly, very slowly, I began to understand that the way my mother had treated me wasn't normal or healthy. I started recognizing that other parents showed pride in their children's efforts, not just their results. I saw families where mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than personal failures. I witnessed unconditional love and support that didn't fluctuate based on performance metrics. After graduation, I moved to a different city and built a life that made me genuinely happy. I found work that I enjoyed and was good at. I developed friendships based on mutual affection rather than meeting someone else's standards. I learned to quiet that critical voice in my head and replace it with something kinder and more supportive. But I still dreaded going home for holidays because being around my mother immediately triggered all those old patterns of anxiety and self-doubt. Within hours of arriving at her house, I'd revert to feeling like that insecure, never good enough teenager who was constantly walking on eggshells. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving when I was 26 years old. I'd been living independently for several years and had been working with a therapist to understand and heal from the emotional damage of my childhood. I felt stronger and more confident than I'd ever felt in my life. But I still hadn't directly confronted my mother about her parenting. That Thanksgiving started typically. Within the first hour of my arrival, my mother had criticized my haircut, asked pointed questions about my salary that implied I should be making more money, and made several comments about my single status that suggested there was something wrong with me for not being married yet. I kept trying to redirect conversations to neutral topics, but she seemed determined to find fault with every aspect of my life. She criticized the career path I'd chosen, the city I lived in, the friends I spent time with, and even the clothes I'd packed for the visit. The final straw came during dinner when she started telling a story to my uncle about what a difficult child I'd been, recounting incidents from when I was 7 or 8 years old as if they were evidence of fundamental character flaws. She was laughing while describing times when I'd been punished for normal childhood behavior, making me sound like I'd been some kind of problem child who required constant correction. Something inside me snapped as I listened to her turn moments from my childhood, moments when I'd been hurt, confused, and desperately trying to win her approval, into amusing anecdotes about what a burden I'd been. I put down my fork, looked directly at her, and said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. The way you parented me was emotionally abusive, and it took me years of therapy to recover from the damage it caused." The entire table went silent. My mother's face went through about 5 different expressions before settling on indignant shock. She started to respond with her usual deflections about how she'd only wanted the best for me and had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. But I didn't let her finish. For the first time in my life, I kept talking instead of backing down when she showed displeasure with what I was saying. I told her that constantly criticizing a child doesn't motivate them to do better. It teaches them that they're inherently flawed and unworthy of love. I explained that her impossibly high standards had given me anxiety and perfectionism that had made my teenage years miserable and my early 20s difficult. I said that a mother's job is to be her child's safe harbor, not their harshest critic. That children need to feel unconditionally loved and accepted, not constantly evaluated and found wanting. That the voice she'd put in my head had told me I was worthless for years before I learned to replace it with something healthier. My mother tried several times to interrupt, to defend her choices, or minimize the impact they'd had on me. But I'd spent 6 years in therapy, learning to articulate exactly what had been wrong with my childhood, and I wasn't going to be silenced anymore. I told her that I'd forgiven her because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting her, but that forgiveness didn't mean pretending that what happened was okay, or that it hadn't affected me profoundly. I explained that I loved her and wanted to have a relationship with her, but that it would need to be built on honesty about the past and respect for the person I'd become, not continued attempts to control or criticize me. The confrontation lasted about 20 minutes, with various family members trying to interrupt or change the subject, but I refused to be derailed. This was a conversation I'd needed to have for years, and I wasn't going to let anyone convince me that keeping the peace was more important than telling the truth. My mother spent the rest of that weekend alternating between angry silence and attempts to guilt me for ruining Thanksgiving and being ungrateful for everything she'd provided. But for the first time in my life, her disapproval didn't devastate me. I'd said what needed to be said, and I felt lighter and more authentic than I had in years. The aftermath was complicated. Some family members supported me, and admitted they'd always been concerned about how critical my mother was. Others felt I'd been unnecessarily harsh and should have handled things privately. My mother and I didn't speak for about 3 months. When we finally reconnected, our relationship was completely different. She was more careful about how she spoke to me, and I was more willing to set boundaries when conversations headed in unhealthy directions. It wasn't the warm, supportive mother-daughter relationship I'd always wished for, but it was honest in a way it had never been before. Over the years since that Thanksgiving, my mother has gradually acknowledged some of the ways her parenting affected me, though she's never fully apologized or taken complete responsibility. But I no longer need her to validate my experience because I've learned to validate it myself. That confrontation taught me that speaking truth to power, even when the power is someone you love who raised you, is sometimes necessary for your own mental health and integrity. It taught me that family relationships built on silence and denial aren't actually protecting anyone. They're just postponing necessary conversations. Most importantly, it taught me that the child I used to be deserved someone to stand up for her. And if no one else was going to do it, I needed to do it myself, even if it was 20 years too late. Now, when I hear parents constantly criticizing their children or setting impossible standards, I speak up when appropriate. I've learned that breaking cycles of emotional damage often requires someone to be brave enough to name what's happening and refuse to participate in the silence that allows it to continue. That Thanksgiving changed my relationship not just with my mother, but with myself. I learned that I could survive her disapproval, which meant I could finally stop organizing my entire life around avoiding it. That freedom was worth every uncomfortable moment of that conversation. That's the end of that story. Sarah had to become the advocate for her younger self that no one had ever been. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to pretend that your childhood was healthier than it actually was. Breaking generational cycles of emotional damage requires someone to be willing to name what happened and insist that it wasn't okay. That Thanksgiving wasn't about ruining a holiday. It was about finally telling the truth after decades of silence. Our next story comes from someone who learned that losing someone teaches you as much about living as it does about dying. I'm Michael, and this story is about the 23 minutes that taught me everything I know about what it means to live a meaningful life. My grandfather was 91 years old when he went into the hospital for what we thought would be a routine procedure to clear a blockage in his heart. He'd been living independently, driving himself to the grocery store, maintaining his garden, and beating me at chess every time I visited. The doctors were optimistic about his recovery, and we all expected him to be home within a few days. But complications developed during the surgery. His heart stopped twice on the operating table, and when they finally stabilized him, the doctors told us that his organs were shutting down. They said he might have hours, maybe a day or two if we were lucky. I was 28 at the time, working in finance in a job that consumed 60 hours a week and left me feeling empty and exhausted. I'd been putting off visiting my grandfather for months, always telling myself I'd make time soon, always prioritizing work deadlines and social obligations over spending time with the most important person from my childhood. When I got the call about his condition, I was in the middle of a presentation that I'd been preparing for weeks. I left immediately, driving 3 hours to the hospital, while calling everyone in my family to coordinate who would be there and when. By the time I arrived, my grandfather was conscious but clearly weak. He was surrounded by machines and tubes, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. But when he saw me walk into the room, his face lit up with the same smile he'd given me since I was 5 years old. We only had about 23 minutes alone together before other family members arrived, and before the medications made him too drowsy to have coherent conversations. But those 23 minutes changed my entire perspective on what matters in life. My grandfather didn't want to talk about his medical condition or the procedures he'd undergone. He didn't seem afraid of dying or bitter about the timing. Instead, he wanted to talk about memories we'd shared and lessons he hoped I'd remember after he was gone. He reminded me of the summer when I was 12 and had spent 2 weeks at his house, helping him build a deck in his backyard. I'd been going through a difficult phase, dealing with my parents' divorce and feeling angry at the world in general. My grandfather had somehow convinced me to help him with this construction project, even though I knew nothing about building and wasn't particularly interested in learning. What I remembered about that summer was how tedious and frustrating the work had been, how many mistakes I'd made, how many times I'd wanted to quit and go inside to play video games instead. But my grandfather remembered something completely different. He told me that watching me learn to measure twice and cut once, seeing me problem solve when things didn't fit together the way we'd planned, witnessing my pride when we finally completed something with our hands, those had been some of the most meaningful moments of his life. He said that summer had taught him as much as it had taught me. My grandfather talked about how much he'd enjoyed our monthly dinners when I was in college, when I'd drive to his house and we'd cook together and talk about everything from history to philosophy to girls I was dating. He said those conversations had kept him feeling connected to the world as it changed around him, that my questions and perspectives had challenged him to keep thinking and growing, even in his 80s. I'd never realized that those dinners meant as much to him as they'd meant to me. I thought I was just visiting an old man who might be lonely. But he told me that I'd been giving him purpose and intellectual stimulation during a period when many of his peers were becoming isolated and withdrawn. Then, my grandfather said something that I'll never forget. "Michael, I've been thinking about what I want you to remember about me after I'm gone, and I realized that the most important thing isn't any specific advice or wisdom I could give you. It's the fact that the moments when I felt most alive, most like myself, most proud of who I was, those were almost always moments when I was helping someone else become who they were meant to be." He talked about the satisfaction he'd gotten from teaching me to drive, from helping my cousins with their college applications, from mentoring younger colleagues when he was still working. He said that the times in his life when he'd felt most purposeful were the times when he'd been able to use his experience and skills to help other people navigate their own challenges. My grandfather told me that he was proud of my career success, but that he worried I was spending so much time climbing ladders that I wasn't taking time to help other people climb theirs. He said that all the professional achievements I was working toward would feel empty if I didn't find ways to connect them to something larger than my own ambitions. He asked me about my friendships, my relationships, my hobbies, all the parts of life I'd been neglecting while focusing on work. When I told him honestly that I didn't have much time for any of those things, he looked sad but not surprised. "Michael," he said, "I'm 91 years old, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no one on their deathbed wishes they'd spent more time at the office. The things that matter, relationships, experiences, the ways you've helped other people, the moments when you felt truly alive, those are the things you'll want to remember at the end." He told me about letters he still had from students he'd taught 40 years earlier, thanking him for believing in them when they didn't believe in themselves. He talked about the satisfaction he got from seeing his children and grandchildren become independent, capable adults. He mentioned small acts of kindness from decades ago that had apparently shaped his sense of who he was as a person. What struck me was how few of the things he considered most meaningful had anything to do with traditional markers of success. He'd had a good career, owned a nice home, saved money for retirement, all the things I was working toward. But when he reflected on his life from the perspective of someone who was about to lose it, those achievements barely came up. Instead, he talked about relationships, growth, service, and moments of connection. He talked about times when he'd been fully present instead of distracted by obligations or ambition. He talked about the joy of learning new things, even late in life, and the satisfaction of passing knowledge and values on to younger generations. My grandfather died 2 days later, peacefully and surrounded by family. But that conversation in the hospital changed the entire trajectory of my life. Within 6 months, I'd left my finance job and started teaching high school mathematics. It was a dramatic pay cut and a complete career change that confused most of my friends. But it felt like the first authentic decision I'd made in years. I discovered that I loved teaching, that helping teenagers understand complex concepts and gain confidence in their abilities gave me a sense of purpose that I'd never experienced in the corporate world. I started volunteering as a tutor for students who couldn't afford private help, and later became involved in educational nonprofits that served underprivileged communities. I also started prioritizing relationships and experiences over career advancement and material accumulation. I began traveling more, spending more time with friends and family, and pursuing hobbies that brought me joy rather than professional benefits. 10 years later, I'm married to someone I met through my volunteer work, and we have 2 children who are growing up with the kind of present, engaged father that my grandfather had been to me. I make less money than I probably could in other fields, but I've never felt richer in terms of meaningful connections and purposeful work. Every major decision I've made since that hospital conversation has been filtered through the question my grandfather helped me understand. At the end of my life, what will I want to remember? What will make me feel proud of how I spent my time on Earth? That 23-minute conversation taught me that legacy isn't about the things you accumulate or the titles you earn. It's about the lives you touch, the growth you facilitate, and the love you share while you have the chance. My grandfather gave me the gift of perspective when I still had time to act on it. He showed me that wisdom isn't just about giving advice. It's about helping people ask the right questions about their own lives. That's the end of that story. Michael's grandfather used his final moments of clarity to give the most important gift he could, a completely different way of measuring what makes life meaningful. 23 minutes of conversation provided a lifetime of direction. Sometimes the people we're about to lose see most clearly what the people who still have time are missing. That hospital room became a classroom where the final lesson was about how to actually live. Let's move to our next story, which shows that sometimes the thing you're most afraid of is exactly what you need to face to become who you're meant to be. I'm Emma, and this story is about the day I thought I was dying, but was actually being reborn. I'd always been what people called a quiet person. I preferred listening to talking, reading to socializing, and staying in the background rather than drawing attention to myself. In school, I was the kid who never raised her hand, even when I knew the answer. At work, I was the one who did excellent work but never spoke up in meetings or shared ideas publicly. This wasn't just shyness. It was a deep, paralyzing fear of being seen, judged, or criticized. I'd built my entire life around avoiding situations where I might have to speak publicly, defend my opinions, or risk being wrong in front of other people. I worked as a graphic designer at a small marketing agency where I could mostly communicate through email and focus on creative work that didn't require presentations or public speaking. I'd chosen this career partly because I was good at visual communication, but also because it allowed me to hide behind my computer screen most of the day. For 3 years, this arrangement worked perfectly. I produced great work, got positive feedback from clients, and received regular raises. My boss seemed happy with my performance, and I felt safe in my role as the talented but invisible team member who contributed through work product rather than verbal participation. Then, the agency landed its biggest client ever, a tech startup that needed a complete rebrand and marketing campaign. It was the kind of project that could transform our small company into a major player in the industry. Everyone was excited about the opportunity and the potential for growth. The problem was that the client wanted to be heavily involved in the creative process. They wanted regular presentations, collaborative brainstorming sessions, and detailed explanations of our design choices. Suddenly, my job required exactly the kind of public speaking and real-time interaction that I'd spent my career avoiding. My boss assigned me to lead the visual design component of the project, which meant I'd need to present my concepts to the client team every 2 weeks and defend my creative decisions in front of groups of people I didn't know. It was both a huge professional opportunity and my worst nightmare rolled into one assignment. For the first few weeks, I managed to participate in meetings by preparing extensively beforehand and speaking as little as possible. I'd create detailed slide presentations that could mostly speak for themselves, and I'd let my boss handle most of the discussion while I nodded and added brief comments when directly asked questions. But as the project progressed, the client started asking more complex questions about design theory, brand psychology, and creative strategy, topics I knew extensively but had never had to articulate out loud to a group of strangers. They wanted real-time brainstorming, spontaneous problem-solving, and the kind of dynamic creative collaboration that required me to think out loud and share half-formed ideas. The anxiety I felt before each meeting became increasingly overwhelming. I'd spend the night before each presentation lying awake, imagining all the ways I might embarrass myself or say something stupid. I'd rehearse answers to questions I thought they might ask, but then panic when they asked something I hadn't prepared for. 3 months into the project, we had a particularly important presentation where I needed to present 4 different logo concepts and explain the strategic thinking behind each one. I'd spent weeks perfecting these designs and felt confident about the work itself, but I was terrified about having to explain and defend my choices in front of the 10-person client team. The morning of the presentation, I woke up feeling nauseated and shaky. By the time I got to the office, my hands were trembling and I was having trouble concentrating. I kept telling myself that I just needed to get through the next 2 hours, and then I could go back to working quietly at my computer. But when I stood up in that conference room and looked at all those faces waiting for me to speak, something catastrophic happened in my brain and body. My vision started tunneling. My heart started racing so fast I thought it might explode, and I couldn't catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. I felt like I was suffocating and having a heart attack simultaneously. The room started spinning. My hands went numb, and I was absolutely convinced that I was about to die in front of all these people. I tried to excuse myself to go to the bathroom, but I couldn't form words, and my legs felt like they might not support me. My boss realized something was seriously wrong and quickly ended the meeting, telling the clients we'd rescheduled due to a technical issue. A coworker drove me to the emergency room because I was certain I was having some kind of medical crisis that required immediate attention. After 3 hours of tests and monitoring, the ER doctor told me that I'd experienced a severe panic attack. My heart was fine, my lungs were fine, my blood work was normal. What had felt like dying was actually my body's extreme response to psychological stress and fear. The doctor recommended that I follow up with my primary care physician and consider seeing a therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders. She explained that panic attacks were treatable and that many people who experienced them went on to live normal, healthy lives. But sitting in that hospital bed, wearing a gown, and connected to monitors, because I'd been too scared to give a work presentation, I felt like the most pathetic person alive. I was 29 years old and apparently so broken that normal professional activities could literally send me to the emergency room. The worst part was realizing that this panic attack wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of years of avoiding situations that made me uncomfortable. I'd been so committed to staying in my comfort zone that I'd never developed the skills or confidence needed to handle normal adult challenges. I took a week off work to recover and think about what had happened. During that time, I did something I'd never done before. I researched panic attacks, anxiety disorders, and treatment options. I learned that what I'd experienced was actually quite common, especially among people who'd spent years avoiding anxiety-provoking situations. More importantly, I learned that the only way to overcome this kind of fear was to face it gradually and systematically, with appropriate support and coping strategies. Continuing to avoid public speaking and group interactions would only make the anxiety worse over time. I found a therapist who specialized in anxiety and panic disorders, and we started working on what she called exposure therapy. The idea was to gradually expose me to increasingly challenging social and professional situations while teaching me tools for managing anxiety and building confidence. We started small. I practiced reading aloud to myself, then to my therapist, then to small groups of people in safe environments. I learned breathing techniques, cognitive strategies for challenging negative thoughts, and ways to ground myself when I felt overwhelmed. The process was terrifying at first, but also surprisingly empowering. Each time I successfully completed a small challenge, like asking a question in a meeting or introducing myself to a stranger, I gained evidence that I was capable of more than I'd believed. Within 6 months, I was able to return to the client project and complete those presentations I'd been so afraid of. It wasn't comfortable, and I still felt nervous before speaking publicly, but I'd learned that I could tolerate discomfort without it destroying me. The real breakthrough came about a year later when I volunteered to lead a workshop at a design conference. Standing in front of a room of 50 designers, sharing my expertise about visual branding, I realized that I wasn't just surviving public speaking, I was actually enjoying it. I discovered that I had valuable knowledge and perspectives that other people wanted to hear. When I stopped being so focused on my own fear and started focusing on how I could help my audience, the anxiety became manageable and eventually almost disappeared. That panic attack, which had felt like the most humiliating experience of my life, turned out to be the catalyst I needed to develop skills and confidence I never knew I possessed. It forced me to confront the ways that fear had been limiting my personal and professional growth. I'm now 35 and work as a freelance brand consultant, which requires me to present to clients regularly, lead workshops, and speak at industry events. I still feel nervous sometimes, but I've learned that nervousness and excitement can feel very similar in your body. It's your interpretation that makes the difference. More importantly, I've learned that the things we're most afraid of are often the things we most need to do to become who we're meant to be. My fear of being seen and heard had been protecting me from embarrassment, but it had also been protecting me from growth, connection, and opportunities. That panic attack taught me that avoiding discomfort doesn't make you safer, it makes you smaller. Sometimes the scariest thing you can do is exactly what you need to do to find your voice and discover what you're truly capable of. That's the end of that story. Emma's panic attack was her breaking point, but it was also her turning point. Sometimes our bodies force us to confront what our minds have been avoiding. She learned that the voice she'd been so afraid to use was actually one of her greatest assets. Fear had been masquerading as protection, but it was actually prison. That terrifying day in the conference room became the first step toward finding the courage she'd always had but never accessed. Let's move to our final story, which shows how sometimes the people who seem to have the least to offer end up giving you the most important gift of all. I'm Jennifer, and this story is about how a conversation with a stranger completely changed my relationship with money, success, and what it means to live a rich life. I was 25 years old, working 80-hour weeks as an investment banker, making more money than I'd ever imagined possible, and feeling emptier and more miserable than I'd ever felt in my life. I lived in an expensive apartment, wore designer clothes, ate at restaurants that cost more per meal than many people spend on groceries in a week, but I felt hollow and disconnected from anything meaningful. My days were consumed by financial models, client presentations, and deal negotiations that moved millions of dollars around, but never seemed to create anything of lasting value. I barely had time for relationships, hobbies, or anything that brought me genuine joy. I told myself that this sacrifice was temporary, that I was building a foundation for future happiness. But I was beginning to suspect that this lifestyle was just an elaborate form of self-punishment. Every morning, I walked from my apartment to the subway station, taking the same route through downtown that hundreds of other business professionals traveled. We all moved with the same urgent purposefulness, staring at our phones, mentally rehearsing presentations, or calculating how much time we had before our next meeting. About 6 blocks from my building, there was a man who sat on the same corner every day. He looked to be in his 50s, weathered in a way that suggested he'd been living on the streets for years. He had a cardboard sign that said, "Anything helps," and a small plastic cup where people occasionally dropped coins or dollar bills. For months, I walked past this man twice a day without really seeing him. He was just part of the urban landscape, like the hot dog vendors and taxi drivers. People who existed in my peripheral vision, but didn't register as actual human beings, with stories, feelings, or anything worth my attention. I was the kind of person who donated money to charities for the tax deductions, but never actually interacted with people who were experiencing the problems those charities claimed to solve. Homelessness was something I understood intellectually as a social issue, but not something I connected to actual human faces or individual experiences. One Tuesday morning in November, I was running later than usual because my alarm hadn't gone off. I was half jogging toward the subway entrance when I tripped on an uneven piece of sidewalk and went down hard, scraping my knee and tearing my stockings. As I sat on the sidewalk for a moment, checking to see if I was injured and feeling sorry for myself about having to start the day with torn clothing, the homeless man left his corner and walked over to where I'd fallen. "You okay?" he asked, extending a hand to help me up. His voice was kind and concerned, not at all what I'd expected from someone I'd mentally categorized as potentially dangerous or unstable. I accepted his help getting to my feet and thanked him, expecting our interaction to end there. But instead of returning to his corner, he asked if I had anything to clean the scrape on my knee. When I said I didn't, he reached into a backpack beside his spot and pulled out a small packet of antiseptic wipes and a bandage. "You should clean that," he said, handing me the supplies. "Looks like you got some dirt in there." I was stunned by his generosity. Here was a man who obviously had very few possessions, sharing his basic medical supplies with a stranger who could easily afford to buy her own. I tried to give him money to replace what he'd given me, but he refused, saying he was glad he could help. That small act of unexpected kindness bothered me all day. Not bothered in a negative way, but bothered in the sense that it challenged assumptions I hadn't realized I was making about people experiencing homelessness and about what it meant to be generous or wealthy. The next morning, instead of rushing past his corner, I stopped and introduced myself. His name was Robert, and he'd been living on the streets for about 3 years after losing his job as a construction worker due to a back injury that prevented him from doing physical labor. Over the following weeks, I started stopping for brief conversations with Robert most mornings. I learned that he'd been married for 15 years before his wife left him during the financial difficulties that followed his injury. He had 2 adult children who he hadn't spoken to in years because he was ashamed of his circumstances. Robert was intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly knowledgeable about current events despite not having reliable access to internet or television. He spent most of his day in the public library, reading newspapers and books, staying warm, and occasionally using the computers to look for job opportunities that might accommodate his physical limitations. What struck me most about Robert was his attitude toward other people, especially people who were clearly more fortunate than he was. He never seemed bitter or resentful about the inequality he witnessed every day. He didn't complain about the business professionals who walked past him without acknowledgement, or the system that had failed to provide adequate support when he needed it most. Instead, Robert seemed genuinely interested in the lives of people he encountered. He'd ask about my work, my family, my interests, and he'd listen to my answers with the kind of focused attention that I rarely received from my colleagues or friends who weren't struggling to meet their basic needs. One morning in December, I was particularly stressed about a deal that was falling apart and might cost me my year-end bonus. I was complaining to Robert about the pressure I was under and the long hours I'd been working, when he said something that completely shifted my perspective. "Jennifer," he said, "I've been watching people like you walk past this corner for 3 years, and most of them look just as stressed and unhappy as you do right now. I used to think that if I could just get back to having a regular job and a place to live, all my problems would be solved. But talking to you and others, I'm starting to think that having money doesn't automatically make people feel secure or content." He continued, "Don't get me wrong, I'd rather have your problems than mine. But it seems like both of us are worried about things we can't control and missing out on things that are right in front of us." Robert told me that despite his circumstances, he'd found unexpected sources of satisfaction in his daily life. He enjoyed his conversations with regular people like me who stopped to talk. He found meaning in small acts of kindness, like helping someone who'd fallen or sharing information about local resources with other people experiencing homelessness. He said that losing everything he'd thought defined him, his job, his home, his marriage, had been devastating, but it had also forced him to discover what really mattered to him when all the external markers of success were stripped away. "The funny thing," Robert said, "is that I probably have more real conversations in a week than I had in a month when I was working construction and rushing home to watch television every night. I know more about what's happening in the world because I actually have time to read and think. And I've learned that most people are basically good. They just don't always know how to show it." That conversation made me realize that I'd been so focused on accumulating wealth and status that I'd never stopped to consider what I wanted those things to provide. I thought money would give me security, but I felt constantly anxious about losing what I'd gained. I thought success would make me happy, but I felt increasingly isolated and meaningless in my work. Robert, who had virtually nothing in terms of material possessions, seemed more at peace with himself and more connected to other people than I felt, despite having everything our culture told me I should want. Over the following months, I started making changes in my life based on what I'd learned from our conversations. I began volunteering at a local food bank. Not just writing checks, but actually showing up to serve meals and interact with people experiencing food insecurity. I started spending less money on things that were supposed to impress other people and more time on activities that genuinely interested me. I took a pottery class, joined a hiking group, and started reading books for pleasure instead of just for professional development. Most importantly, I began having real conversations with people I encountered in daily life instead of just rushing past them. I discovered that everyone has interesting stories and perspectives if you take the time to listen. A year after meeting Robert, I made the decision to leave investment banking and take a job with a nonprofit that provided financial counseling and job training for people experiencing economic instability. It was a significant pay cut, but it was work that felt connected to something larger than my own ambition. Robert was one of the first people I told about my career change. He said he was proud of me for choosing meaning over money, but he also warned me not to romanticize poverty or assume that financial struggles automatically make people more virtuous or wise. "The best thing about having enough money," he said, "is that it gives you the freedom to focus on other things. The worst thing about not having money is that it's hard to think about anything else. You've got the chance to use your financial security to do something meaningful. That's a kind of wealth most people never figure out how to access." Robert eventually found stable housing through a program for disabled veterans. It turned out he'd served in the military before his construction career. We still stay in touch, and he often reminds me that wealth isn't about how much you have, but about how much you have to give and how connected you feel to the people around you. That accidental fall on the sidewalk led to a friendship that completely changed my understanding of success, generosity, and what it means to live a rich life. Robert taught me that the most valuable things, kindness, wisdom, human connection, sense of purpose, can't be bought or accumulated. They can only be shared and experienced. He showed me that sometimes the people who seem to have the least to offer are actually the ones who understand most clearly what really matters. And he proved that wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by how much you're able to give and how deeply you're able to connect with the world around you. That's the end of that story. Robert's generosity with that bandage and antiseptic wipe was worth more than any bonus Jennifer had ever received. He taught her that true wealth is measured in moments of connection, acts of service, and the peace that comes from knowing what actually matters. Sometimes the people who've lost everything are the ones who can see most clearly what's worth keeping. Jennifer discovered that the richest conversations of her life happened on a street corner with someone society had written off as having nothing to offer. If you enjoyed these stories and found something in them that resonated with your own experience, consider subscribing for more content that explores the deeper lessons hiding in everyday life. Thank you for listening. And remember, everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, learning lessons that might change everything, and carrying stories that could transform your understanding of what's possible. See you in the next one.